Well, throughout our journey through the book of Proverbs up to this point, we find that there's a continual contrast and comparison that goes on, that Solomon talks about wisdom, and then he talks about folly. And we hear the word folly and we think of frivolity or just basically being goofy and telling jokes and hanging out. When I was a young Christian, I had somebody tell me that telling jokes was folly and therefore Christians should never joke around. That was a pretty hard for me to swallow because I love humor and I love puns and things of that nature, and I love telling jokes. And I think they can be very illustrative, and I think they can be very disarming. Many times you can make a point stronger by making it humorous than you can by making it too serious. And many times, even when you're teaching, I find that if I throw in a humorous comment, it kind of takes the pressure off, because when the Spirit is speaking to people, there's really a tenseness that can come into a room because the Holy Spirit is really bringing conviction. And most of us, when we get convicted, we get tense. No, there's no doubt about that. But here now in verse 13, as we begin to come to the end of chapter 9, he talks about folly, and he personifies folly as a woman. And he says that, first of all, folly is loud, she is undisciplined and without knowledge. And then he says, she sits at the door of her house on a seat at the highest point of the city, calling out to those who pass by, who go straight on their way. Let all who are simple, she says, come in here, she says to those who lack judgment. Now, it's really interesting because he says, first of all, folly is loud. And what you find that things that are false oftentimes try to get your attention by really dominating the sound waves. And that's where negative narratives sometimes are just spilled out all over the place. And all you can hear is that negativity or that wrongness. And those who seek to basically take away people's freedom and control a culture basically use that to control the sound waves and the messaging, so that everything you hear reinforces what they're trying to get you to believe, so that you begin to conform based upon the auditory overwhelming, but also they begin to try to silence you and to keep you from thinking outside of the box that they've created for you to be captive by. So he says you have to understand that folly has to yell because it's the only way you can get your attention. It reminds me of a story I heard years ago of a janitor in a church on Monday morning cleaning out the church, and he cleaning the stage, and he sees on the podium the pastor had left his notes, and so he went over to look at the notes to see what was there, and he saw the various points that the pastor preached on that week, and right next to one point it had a little bit of a pencil written in. It said, "Weak point, shout very loudly." And I've often thought that if you have to shout something very loudly, it's probably a weak point. Have you kind of noticed that some of the Marxists that we see profiled in the sound waves today are always yelling curses and profanities and saying things, and they're very loud and very boisterous, but they're not saying anything of substance. They throw out these really nondescript platitudes, if you can even call them that. And when you sit down and think about it, if they sat across the room and just commonly said these things to you, you would look at them and say, but that doesn't make any sense. But somehow, if they get you on an emotional level and get people responding emotively, then people get worked up. But if you ask them, well, why are you angry? Like many of the protesters who were interviewed, what does from the river to the sea mean? Which river are they talking about? What sea are they talking about? And most of them have no idea. They're just there, many of them paid, but they're just there to cause a ruckus. They're against everything because they feel like they're losing in life and they want to get even. Well, whatever the psychological profile is, and I think that's a pretty accurate one, they're loud, and he says, but their problem is they're undisciplined. And secondly, he says they're without knowledge. So basically, they're frustrated with their lives because they're not moving forward, but they don't have any discipline in their life. I think Jordan Peterson put it really well when he said about some of the radicals. He says, don't tell me how to change the world until you have shown me that you know how to clean your room. In other words, if you look at people's personal spaces and you find that their out of the house voice is loud and boisterous and clamoring, and then you go into their homes, you find that their environment is loud and boisterous and clamoring. It's in disorder and disarray. And that's one of those kind of things I try to communicate to people often, and especially my own kids. He said, if your environment is neat and orderly, you usually are in control of what's going on. But if your desk is piled full of stuff and you have just had a bunch of notes and things all over the place, you waste a lot of your life. In fact, what they say is usually people who are disorganized waste 6 years of their life just looking for stuff that they put somewhere and they can't find. So, the idea of being undisciplined, it may sound like, well, I'm free and I just go with the wind. Well, what goes with the wind? Even a ship that uses a sail has to have a rudder to direct it, or the wind will take it to places it doesn't want to go. And many of these places end up where they don't want to be because they don't know where they're going in the first place. So it's important that discipline decides what is the most profitable way I can live my life, and now how do I harness my energy and focus it upon accomplishing that task. That's a disciplined life. And he says the reason they aren't disciplined because they don't know what they're doing. They're without knowledge. Really, they don't have a clue what they're doing. They don't have a clear clue what their life is about, what their purpose is. If you press them on that, they might get very angry, but they can't define for you why they're here and what life is about. And if they do, many times it comes down to such a trivial thing like sensual pleasure that they themselves realize that's no way to live your life, but that's a way to waste your life. Well, it's interesting because before Solomon said, wisdom sits at the highest place of the city and cries out to the simple, those who are naive and uninformed, not the fools. The fools never listen to wisdom. But he said the folly or the fool also sits on the highest places, tries to have the highest position, to shout the loudest, to control the narrative, the conversation. And they're calling out to whoever comes by. And they're basically saying, you who are naive or simple, inexperienced in life, who don't know really how to do the math of life accurately, follow me. Because why? Because you lack judgment. Now, judgment comes from experience in many ways. It begins, first of all, by accepting a set of rules for life. Essentially, when Jordan Peterson wrote his book, The 12 Rules of Life, he was helping a lot of that millennial generation and the Generation Z to find out these are the things that work, and we know this by experience, and these are the things that do not work. Well, we have something very similar like that in the Bible. It's called the 10 Commandments. And so we can look at the 10 Commandments and God says, here are the rules of life. If you submit to these things, you'll find that God's blessing will be upon you. And if you ignore them, you'll find that negative consequences come. So how do you have good judgment? Well, you begin by having a basis upon which the rules of life are before you. And then you begin to apply those rules to life on an everyday basis. And that helps you to make the right choices, the right judgment. There's ones like, don't lie. Well, if I know I'm not supposed to lie, then when I come to that moment where lying, I think, might get me out of trouble, but I know that God says don't, and I say, I'm going to tell the truth, even though it may cost me. At that moment, God says, I'm going to bless you because you did that. But the person who lies and disregards that rule ends up suffering the consequences down the road because, as I said before, lies come back. They're boomerangs on those lies. They circle around and hit you from behind when you're not expecting them. And that's the problem with it. People who become pathological liars, they can't remember their own lives. And sooner or later, people begin to realize they're inconsistent in their story because it just simply changes as they see the circumstance. But I think the biggest lie, and I think that's the one we'll look at tomorrow, is that basically he says that stolen waters are sweet and food eaten in secret is delicious. In other words, the basic lie is disobedience is more profitable than obedience. Ignoring the rules where it says do not steal, do not lie, do not covet, do not commit adultery, all those kinds of things. He's basically ignoring those and saying, no, I'm going to do those things because that's where the fun is, has been the destruction of many lives. But we'll get to that tomorrow, which will also be our conclusion of chapter 9. Blessings.